Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm from our headquarters in Milford, Massachusetts. So it's actually been a very pleasant trip out here. As Rich said, I work at Waters. I'm in the applications lab. And my job is really to look at our instrumentation as well as competitive instrumentation. We know that a lot of our customers need to do methods transfer. And so we're trying to help educate customers onto the nuances or the differences of instrumentation and how those differences might impact a methods transfer. So really providing tools for methods transfer. So we know that everyone has a variety of instrumentation in their labs. Whether you call them different things, our vendors tend to call them HPLC, UHPLC, and UPLC. And I'll talk a little bit about the differences and specifically how they can impact methods transfer. But some of the drivers right now, specifically with pharmaceutical companies, but with many other companies, is there's a real need to modernize laboratories to make sure we're getting the most efficiency out of our instrumentation, utilizing instrumentation to the fullest advantage, and also to manage the diversity of available platforms. And with this modernization, part of what kicked it off is that back in 2014, the FDA came out with some guidance about modernizing methods. And they really wanted to push the industry to modernize their methods to overcome some of the older legacy methods that maybe had some issues. So there was some regulatory relief for making some changes to existing methods in annual reports. And at the time, the FDA recognized that they published some guidelines for method changes. So they recognized that there was a need to balance changes to methods, really to meet your system suitability criteria. And with that, they said that minor adjustments could be filed in an annual report with no fees. Moderate, you needed supplemental material. And obviously, if you needed a major change, you needed prior approval. But you could use the same methodology, you just needed to show equivalency. And when the FDA came out with that, the US Pharmacopoeia, which helps devise a lot of, for those who are not in pharmaceuticals, they have a lot of pharmaceutical guidances and monographs where a lot of generic and manufacturers follow. So they actually also partnered with the FDA to kind of propel to a modernization effort. For the USP, for those not aware, what they have are a lot of older TLC methods. So those were the first methods that they really wanted to modernize. And when they did that, they also came out with some guidances. They recognized different types of method transfer or method improvement. There's the LC instrument method transfer, which I'll talk about in later detail, but in general, you needed to use the same or equivalent column, but they recognized that there was differences in instrumentation. They also allow for adjustments of methods, and that's if you do not meet your system suitability criteria. And this is per the USP. So they outlined a series of adjustments that are permissible. And then lastly, they also recognize that some people need to change their method. And that would be a significant change and full validation would be required. So in March of 2014, the USP came out with their 621 chromatography chapter, and within it they defined allowable adjustments. These are adjustments, again, that can be made to a USP method to meet your system suitability criteria, and you wouldn't require a full revalidation. But some of those guidelines were a little different than previous versions. So before 2014, there was a generic set of adjustments that could be made. It was in USP 36 NF 31. And just for reference, right now we're up to USP 39, but none of these changes have been any different. What happened was they went from a generic set of conditions to really looking at the science behind the allowable adjustments. And the USP at that time felt much more comfortable with changes permitted to isocratic methods. So they allowed changes to your particle size and column length based on your L/dP ratio. That's the length divided by the particle size, and that's a measure of the efficiency of the column. They also allow adjustment for your flow rate based on the particle size and your column ID. And the column ID could be adjusted along with the flow rate. They also allowed injection volumes and temperature, and there are a myriad other set of changes that they allowed. But what they didn't allow was some of these changes in gradient methods. So they said, we feel much more comfortable with customers who are running isocratic methods. We understand the theory. We understand that these calculations can be made easily. So we're okay with those, but not with gradient methods. So what does that mean? Well, one of the changes that was allowed was to make adjustments for dwell volume. And I'm going to cover that in more detail later. But if you were to take a method on one system and transfer it to another, you could make adjustments for the dwell volume of the system or the gradient delay. Other adjustments that are allowed were you could change, as I said, your isocratic method, keeping the L over DP ratio constant. And what that allows everyone to do is to modernize their methods. So if you have an HPLC method, on this is an example is a 4.6 by 255 micron. You can adjust your flow rates going to a smaller column, a 4.6 by 100, 2.7 micron. We're keeping the column efficiency similar, but we're adjusting our flow rate and our injection volume. And so what we can get is a modernization of our method. We can significantly reduce the runtime while meeting all of the system suitability criteria. With gradient methods, we can also do this. But because, as I said before, the USP was not comfortable with changes to gradient methods, this type of change would require a full revalidation. But again, you can change your column length and particle size appropriately, as well as your flow rate, to get a faster method. So those are some of the method transfer approaches that the USP has okayed. And this is really a segue into the more kind of academic part of the discussion, where we look really at instrumentation. But the method transfer approaches that the USP allows are use your existing method. You can adjust the method within the chapter, or you can develop and do a full revalidation. So what most of my talk will be about is that in my lab, I do look at competitive instrumentation as well as Waters instrumentation. There are a lot of nuances and differences about pumps, injectors, column managers that maybe a lot of isn't always particularly aware. So we're kind of looking at from a more academic standpoint on how these differences can impact our methods transfer. So we have our system dwell volume, which is a big component. Extra column dispersion can impact methods transfer, and then we'll also show how temperature control and related effects can impact our methods transfer. So some of the common components or the characteristics of systems that maybe people don't always think about are the dwell volume, which is the gradient delay. That's the volume from the point of mixing or point of gradient delivery to the head of your column. And then there's also extra column volume, or we call them extra column dispersion. And that's the volume from the injector up to your detector flow cell, but it doesn't include the column. And that's a volume that can impact dispersion or band spread in your separation. So these are some of the things that we're going to cover in our discussion. I'm going to break down each one and talk about how we've studied them in our laboratory and how we've applied those studies to methods transfer. So dwell volume, that's the first part. When we program a gradient, there's always going to be a delay to when it reaches the head of the column. That's true of every system. But depending on the age, the type of system, and the vintage, that volume can vary significantly. So when we transfer a method from one system to another, this delay might reach the head of the column at different points. So this is called our dwell volume. And there's a in a lot of the common chromatography guidelines, there is really a classical way to measure this. And the easiest way to understand it in your system is when you program your gradient to just add a tracer into your B line. We kept our mobile phase composition the same and added a 10 mg per liter of caffeine. And we measured our absorbance. And obviously we can see here there's a delay. So that's the delay that our programmed gradient reaches the head of the column. And because the liftoff and touchdown can vary, we really need to measure the delay at 50%. So that's what most academics do and most vendors do as well. So as I said before, we look at a lot of different instrumentation in our laboratory. We look at our instrumentation as well as other vendors' instrumentation to understand how these characteristics can vary. Obviously, we have binary pumps where the mixing or the gradient delay occurs from the point of mixing to the head of the column. But we also have quaternary pumps where we have a gradient proportioning valve. And after that is typically our mixer, and then we go to the head of the column. These are our pump heads, by the way, our primary and accumulator. But in general, because of the design, quaternary systems have larger dwell volume than binary systems. And that's true of systems within a class, so HPLC systems or UPLC systems. But with some of the modern advances in instrumentation, there are some differences. So a lot of vendors have actually significantly reduced the dwell volume of systems. But as I said before, we measured a variety of systems in our lab. So we looked at HPLCs, UHPLCs, which is somewhat higher pressure and flow rate, higher pressures than HPLCs, and then UPLCs. And in general, the HPLCs, the older systems, have larger dwell volume than the newer systems. And it can be significantly different. So what does that look like in real chromatography? Well, if we take a system that we measured our dwell volume of 1.3 mils in this example, and we transferred our method, and this was just a generic mix of small molecules, we can see that we get a slight shift in retention time. Now, I do want to point out if we used relative retention time, which is often a criteria for methods, there wouldn't be any changes. But retention time, we see a shift. And per the USP, we can adjust our gradient delay and get more comparable retention times on our method transfer. This is just an example that how you can see that by adjusting your gradient delay, your retention time deviation can be lower and match up more better with your system. But that's a very slight or not an extreme example. Oftentimes, everyone has much different systems in our laboratory. This is an example where we actually ran a gradient in both a UPLC and an HPLC. And it really also shows not just the gradient delay, but also differences in mixing behavior. So here we can see the HPLC system has a much larger delay than our UPLC system. But the other thing we can see is that the high organic percent, our asymptote, or where we approach our linear portion at the high organic, because the HPLC system has a much lower pressure mixing, we have a much greater curve, and it takes a little longer to reach that equilibration. Again, when we go back down to our initial conditions, the HPLC system takes a little bit longer to reach those initial equilibration conditions. And the point of this really is if you were to take a method from a UPLC and just run it without any changes on an HPLC, you would not only see retention time shifts, but if you didn't equilibrate properly or you cut your runtime off a little bit, your column may not be re-equilibrated before you perform the next injection. And so that would be something you would see after your first injection. So what can you do per the USP? And we really are trying to minimize changes that people have to make. But again, as I said before, the USP does allow adjustments for dwell volume and in isocratic methods. And so we wanted to design more software tools so that customers could adjust the gradient or the dwell volume without maybe necessarily changing their gradient. So Waters has a lot of tools, and other vendors do as well. Every vendor has a columns calculator. you don't only need it to use for columns or changing columns, but you can also use it to transfer a method from one instrument to another. So in our columns calculator, we entered the same column dimensions, but we just entered the dwell volume differences of our two systems. The reason we ask for that is that can impact, specifically in gradient methods, how long you have your initial hold. So when we transfer a UPLC method to an HPLC, we have a required 775 microliter pre-injection volume. So what that does is reduces our dwell volume on our HPLC to mimic our UPLC. So we take that number, and we have software where we can adjust the injection relative to the gradient start. You can also just change the gradient table and add the time. So there are those two options. But what we did was, in waters, we have, typically you have your injection and your gradient start together. But you can also have your injection start and wait to start your gradient to increase your dwell volume. Or you can alternately start your gradient and then wait to inject, and that decreases dwell volume. So these are tools to kind of manipulate your dwell volume. But when we apply these tools, what we can see here is if we took our UPLC separation and went to an HPLC without any adjustments to our method, we get a significant difference in retention time. And we would want to make sure we didn't troubleshoot things that weren't wrong. And it's really just the dwell volume differences. So when we use the method editor injection function, we get our retention times matching up. Now, because this is a UPLC, we have much higher sensitivity, and I'll talk about that because of extra column dispersion. But we are getting comparable chromatography. Also at Waters, we've designed some other tools to help people with methods transfer, and other vendors have done this as well. But many instruments have multiple paths. So that allows you to look at two different paths on the same instrument. And what that looks like on our software is there's just a path that you can select. And with the Gradient SmartStart, you can use these tools to kind of emulate another separation. So this is a binary system where we ran an HPLC method. And as I said before, we have it as well as other vendors. We have two paths you can select, and that allows you to look at two different dwell volumes. And this is a really nice illustration of how dwell volume can impact your retention times. So this path 1 has a larger dwell volume than path 2. So we can see here it's much closer to our original method than path 2, where everything comes out earlier. So with the tools, we can adjust our gradient delay. This is the initial original HPLC gradient delay. And if we want to get close, we have our path 1. Then we can adjust our gradient start to mimic our original method. So these two tools kind of get us closer. So what that looks like is when we added the adjustment in start time, we can see how our retention times match up much closely. And again, you can do this by adjusting your gradient table. This is one of the reasons that people almost always recommend having an initial isocratic hold in your method. Because when you go from a system with smaller dwell volume to larger, it's easier to extend the hold. But when you go backwards, if you don't have a hold and you start your gradient, it's a little harder to kind of cut off the beginning of the gradient. So that's why a lot of people just generally have isocratic holds to kind of make sure they don't need to adjust that part. But this is really what you end up getting. So you can match up your retention times with your dwell volume, with your systems. Now, dwell volume is one part, but extra column dispersion is also another part of instruments. And this is often sometimes overlooked because I think people will mix and match tubing or even components, and that's fine. A lot of manufacturers encourage people to mix and match components, but as long as you understand the characteristics of what you're matching or mixing up. So dispersion has two predominant components. There's broadening of an analyte on both on column, so that's related to the particle size and the column ID and the length of the column. And then there's also the system effects. That's related to your tubing internal ID, your connections, valves that you may have, as well as detector flow cells. And so extra column dispersion or system dispersion can be matched with your flow rate range to give you the best analytical efficiency out of your column. So many of us talk about in the industry about HPLC, UHPLC, and UPLC. And I think sometimes we're not always really clear what we're talking about. But in general, we try to match the performance of the instrument with the category. So what that means is HPLC systems tend to have larger ID tubing and greater dispersion. They have a lower pressure rate range. That's why they have the larger tubing, right? Because if we had really small tubing, we would overpressure easily. And they're really designed for larger HPLC columns. With waters, when we came out with UPLC, we decreased the dispersion to match the smaller particle size columns, and we increased the operating range. So we wanted to take advantage of the low dispersion or the low sub-2 micron columns with our low dispersion system. So that's how we kind of categorize systems. And as I said before, we measured a variety of our systems in our lab. So we looked at UPLC, HPLC, and UHPLC systems. And we wanted to evaluate everything the same. So we used same unions, same connectors. And we just did an injection of caffeine. This is obviously nothing's retained because there's no column. But these are the injections that we saw on our UPLC, UHPLC, and HPLC systems. And you can see how there's a significant difference in band spread. The other thing I want to point out is we are all guilty of this, but many manufacturers will talk about sigma or 5 sigma or 4 sigma in relation to dispersion. And that's fine as long as you make sure that you're talking about the same value across systems. Because sigma is 50% peak height, and that could give you a very different number than 5 sigma or 4 sigma. So again, we looked at a variety of systems in our lab, and many instrument manufacturers have different systems configurations. They can be configured with preheaters, or with valves, or with different size column managers, and that can impact your extra column dispersion. So for some of the systems, I have a range because that's how we measured it. But in general, HPLC systems have the largest dispersion, while UHPLC systems kind of lie in between, and UPLC systems lie at the bottom. So what does that mean for chromatography? Well, what it really means is we just have to take care to match our system with our column to get the highest efficiency. This was this isocratic separation, and it's a dramatic example because the third peak has a K prime of 1. So obviously, the peak volumes are very small. So because the peak volumes are so small, that extra column dispersion volume is much greater in relation to the peak volumes. So we'll have a significant impact. But what we see here is on our HPLC system with the largest dispersion, on our sub-2 micron column, we can't really see our peaks. But if we scale up, keeping the L over DP ratio consistent, on our 4.6 by 2.7 micron column, we get acceptable chromatography. On our UHPLC, with slightly lower dispersion, we are getting good chromatography on a 3 millimeter ID column. And then with our UPLC, with the lowest dispersion, we are getting acceptable chromatography with both the 2.1 and the 3 millimeter ID columns. On the 4.6, we're seeing some strong solvent effects, and I'll talk about that in more detail later. But in general, if we match our column ID and particle size with our system dispersion, we can get acceptable chromatography and appropriate method transfer. In gradient separations, this difference is not as noticeable, but it can still be seen subtly. This is an example of a UHPLC system with extra column dispersion of about 25 microliters, and we scaled it also down to a UPLC And on this 2.1 by 50 millimeter column, we can see how the dispersion of the system has a slight impact on our separation. So this may be one of those examples where it's not obvious initially, but we may wonder why our resolution has decreased. And it's really just the dispersion of the system. But it's not just pre-column dispersion that can impact our separation, it's also post-column dispersion. Many vendors have different flow cells that are designed for different applications. So in this example, we're running a 2.1 millimeter, 2.7 micron column on an HPLC system. And we have a microbore flow cell, which is about half the volume of the analytical flow cell. So we're going from about 9.8 microliter analytical flow cell to about 4.9 microliter microbore flow cell. And what we get is we get about a 50% improvement in resolution. And even though our flow path length is shorter, we would expect to get lower sensitivity based on Beer's law. But because our peaks are a little narrower, we actually are getting the same sensitivity or comparable sensitivity on our shorter flow path length flow cell. So this is just an example of how something at the back end of your instrument can impact your extra column dispersion. So now I'm going to cover some of the other factors that I don't think often are thought about when we think about methods transfer. Many manufacturers have preheaters, and sometimes people use them and sometimes they don't use them. And these can impact your separation, really if you're at temperatures of above like 30, 35. So this is an example where we ran on a UPLC with an active preheater and we went to transfer to our HPLC system. Our HPLC system did not have a preheater. So we actually saw lower, broader peaks, and initially we thought that was due to the dispersion of the system. But what it was actually due is to thermal effects. So what that is if you get a temperature gradient down the length of your column, you can get peak distortion. So when we actually added some more tubing, which would increase our system dispersion, we actually saw a significant improvement in our peak shape. And that's because as our mobile phase went through the column, we reached that equilibrium and we weren't getting any peak distortions. Vendors, we have them, other vendors do, but there are different types of preheaters. There's a passive preheater, which really means that you're heating up your mobile phase by coming into contact with a heated surface. And then there's an active preheater, which means you're using electronics to control your mobile phase temperature. Both of these have their advantages and drawbacks. Many vendors will actually specify for the preheaters what flow rate ranges could be acceptable. I know other vendors have different size passive preheaters, and you're supposed to use a specific size for different flow rate and column dimensions. But if you control your temperature adequately, here we can see that we get comparable chromatography on active and passive preheating, as well as another system with passive preheating. But the impact of preheating can vary significantly with your separation. So some compounds are much more temperature sensitive than others. For those that aren't temperature sensitive, you often won't see a difference. But in this example, we have an HPLC with passive preheating and an Acuity UPLC with active preheating. We did a study looking at temperatures from 36 to 60 degrees. And what we saw was we saw changes in selectivity with our temperature. In these two examples, we were looking to see if there were any differences actually in temperature. And what we saw was that both of these instruments gave very similar selectivity differences with temperature. As we increased from 36 to 40, we got coelution of those peaks. And then at 48, we got a change in selectivity. We actually graphed for one of the compounds, the retention times. And we can see here that when we use preheating, we get comparable retention time differences for the components. But when we don't use preheating, we start out with about the same amount of difference in retention time, but there's a somewhat divergence in, at the higher temperatures. And that's because of the column temperature differences as well. But the important thing is that if we run on a system with preheating, and we are specifically really at an elevated temperature, and our components are temperature sensitive, we actually need to make sure that our new system has similar, it's similarly configured, so to speak. So in this example, we have an HPLC system without preheating, and we transfer it to our H-class. Without preheating, we get same selectivity. But if we were to have a preheater on another system, we would get changes in our selectivity. And sometimes everyone doesn't always know that they're using a preheater or not using a preheater, and so that's why it's often important to at least document this. But in addition to preheating, I touched upon it a little bit earlier, but you can oftentimes see strong solvent effects when you do your methods transfer. And that's really when, most often it's when you take an HPLC column and an HPLC injection volume and go to a low dispersion system. If your sample is in a very strong sample diluent, you're not getting adequate mixing of your sample with your mobile phase as it travels through the column. And what results is you get peak distortion, and those are strong solvent effects. Oftentimes you'll see them with the early eluting compounds. So for that, you can always add volume to your system before your column, so you can add a loop, or you can lower your injection or scale down your method to a smaller ID column. And these are USP allowable changes. But what it really is, it's really physics. And systems that are configured very similarly or have very similar dispersions will perform very similarly. So this is two systems that have very similar extra column dispersion. And you can see here, this peak actually elutes in the isocratic hold of your separation. And it's a very strong solvent. It's 70% methanol. And we're only starting out at 5% acetonitrile. So there's a very big mismatch between your diluent and your mobile phase. And as we go up in injection volume, we reach the breaking point at very similar points for both of these instruments. And it's actually very small differences that can cause these peak distortion effects. And what you see is you start to see peak splitting. And actually in that example, the other thing I want to talk about is that customers have actually said it's not just strong solvent, it could be pH immiscibility. So if you have a compound that's low pH and your method is at high pH, customers have also seen these strong solvent effects. So now that I've covered some of the factors, I wanted to go over actually a quantitative method transfer that we did in the lab and talk about some of the other factors. So those were some of the physical characteristics, more qualitative aspects, but there are some factors that can impact our quantitative methods transfer. So for this example, I looked at orange extract and I was actually quantitating the 1-flavonoid, and we transferred the method. So first I compared the two systems. The HPLC is a binary, the water systems is a quaternary. Both systems have flow-through needles, which actually makes the method transfer similar. Most vendors have flow-through needles. There are some that have samples that are offline, but that's not as common. It's like our, mostly, I think, high-end mass spec will use those systems. In terms of needle washes, this system had a pre-inject. Ours has a pre- and post-inject, so that's a little different. Both have passive preheating and both used photodiode array or diode array detection. So when we transferred the method, this is without any adjustments to our dwell volume. We could see we get a slight shift in our retention times due to the dwell volume differences, but our relative retention times here are very comparable. So there's not a big difference in relative retention time. We again looked at our quantitation. Again, what we're really looking for, specifically in UV, is to make sure that we're over the whole linear range. Different detectors may have different maximum absorbances, or you may start to fall out of linearity at different points. So this was our linearity, our calibration curves for both of the systems. And again, we got very comparable linearity using the same weighting for both instruments. So that was reassuring. We looked at signal to noise, and we followed actually the USP criteria. So the USP requires you to compare the signal, your blank injection, and compare the noise around where your peak elutes in the blank to your signal in your analyte. So in Empower you can do this automatically, but what we see here is for our lowest limit of quantitation, we met our system suitability. The thing here to point out is that the age of the detectors, so many vendors will have new upgraded detectors, and that's where you're going to see the differences in signal to noise. But they both met them. We also looked at carryover for our samples, and what this really factors into is oftentimes people will have an extra line on a system for washes, or they'll have no line on a system for washes. Instead, they might use a vial. And as long as you try to make sure you match up your needle washes, you can get similar carryover. So we have pre-wash and post-wash, or pre-inject and post-inject. Some vendors actually have pre and post-aspirate, and this one had pre-inject. So you can see here is if you wash your sample, you get comparable carryover to that of another system where you washed your sample. That's why you can't always rely on defaults, because actually different vendors have different defaults, and so they may actually not match up. But when you consider the washes and make them comparable, we could get comparable carryover. And so with that result, we got comparable quantitation for both of these methods. So that was showing how the different factors can impact quantitation. The other thing that we often assist customers with is scaling our methods. So when we scale from UPLC to HPLC or vice versa, we often want to think about things such as solvent compatibility, pressure range, extra column dispersion, and injection volumes. And also, we, as well as other vendors, have a lot of different tools for scaling our methods. So this is a USP method that we're going to show for example. And again, we went to our columns calculator, but everyone has a columns calculator, and they're all usually on the websites. And they're all very good. But what you can see here is if you put in your conditions and your method conditions, you can then scale up. You can not only get the comparable flow rate that you need to use and the adjusted times, but the also pre-inject volume. And what we're really doing is scaling everything for column volumes here. So scaling our column, our flow rate, our injection volume. And then if we do all of these calculations correctly, what we end up with is similar retention times, similar resolution, and comparable chromatography for both of our systems. And we can reduce our runtime from 20 minutes to 4.87 minutes. So that's really using mathematical tools to help us scale our chromatographic separation. And again, we had system suitability criteria for this method. So we met all of the specifications for relative retention time, as well as the resolution and the tailing for the method. So in just reviewing some of the allowable changes and the tools for 621, we can, for isocratic methods, you can scale down very easily without making major changes to your method. For gradient methods, at least for the USP, and I'm not sure about other regulatory agencies, but you do need a full revalidation. And that's similar with the European Pharmacopoeia as well. But systems can provide benefit. We have tools, as well as other vendors have tools, that really help you adjust for maybe your dwell volume differences or other factors like columns calculators. And I hope I've shown a little bit of how different factors can impact your method. When we often run a method on an LC system, there may be a lot of nuances that we're not often thinking about. There are different parts, different physical conditions that will impact our chromatographic separation. And so they can all, if we consider them, it can really help our methods transfer. So these are the major ones, but there are a myriad of others that we've talked to customers about. But thank you for your attention, and if anyone wants to ask any questions or have a discussion, I'd be more than happy to talk about it.